Well, thank you so much for that very, very generous introduction, Corn Jones, Director General for International Cooperation and Development at the European Commission, and to Jeffrey Sachs, Professor Sachs, a long-term fellow traveler. My thanks for the invitation today. Distinguished guests, ambassadors, delegates, partners, colleagues, and friends. It's a distinct privilege and a real pleasure to have the honor to deliver the 2020 Kapuscinski Development Lecture, organized by the Earth Institute of Columbia University in cooperation with the Global Masters of Development Practice and the UN Sustainable Development Network. This year's theme is one that the conference is aptly titled Global Cooperation to Build Back Better. And in this context, you should not be surprised that the central core of my message is that multilateral action can unlock the full potential of a green COVID-19 recovery. But let me start with this triple planetary crisis that we are currently journeying, because as we look at the impact of our action on the planet's ecological and atmospheric stability, we can see that there's something seriously wrong with how our economies and societies operate. While COVID-19 is deadly and destructive, don't get me wrong, we were already deep in the throes of these three planetary crises, the climate crisis, the nature crisis, and the pollution and waste crisis, have been underway for decades.
I was talking about these three crises: the climate crisis, the nature crisis, and the pollution and waste crisis. They have been underway for decades, caused by our unsustainable production and consumption. And we see these crises mirrored in the COVID-19 crisis. We see it also in rising temperatures and wildfires and droughts and floods and hurricanes and all of that. We see it in the debilitating air pollution, and we see it in this inordinate waste and chemical streams, including plastic waste, choking our oceans. Take each of these crises individually and it would be serious. Put them together and these crises together become mind-blowing. Now, science wanders, nature wanders, the climate wanders, the media wanders, some politicians wanders, and yet here we are, counting the costs. Millions of lives have been lost each year, massive economic losses, livelihood, threat to peace, to security and to well-being, and fragile species disappearing into memory. Our way of life, based on producing and consuming and polluting, has brought us here. Even in a time of global belt tightening, humanity still needs 1.6 planets to sustain itself. And nature, which makes human health and prosperity possible, is a breaking point. So why am I saying that multilateralism is still the answer? Well, I'm going to make 2 points about how we can re-engineer our societies and pull back from the brink. One, back strong and reinvigorated multilateralism as a vital tool to ensuring that national efforts join up to fix global problems. And two, recover better from the pandemic by investing in actions to mitigate and eventually halt this triple crisis. Let me start with multilateralism. This year, we mark 75 years of the United Nations. The UN founding documents laid out a vision that was audacious and ambitious, rebuilding a broken world, preventing global conflict, eradicating poverty, all through collective action that would help nations rise together. And in 1972, the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment, at that point, we added the environmental dimension and called for the establishment of the United Nations Environment Programme. Over the years, we've developed a growing understanding of environmental threats to the ozone layer, to climate, to biodiversity, and so on, and the true scale of the risk to our health and prosperity became apparent. International agreements stacked up from the Vienna Convention for the protection of the ozone layer to the 3 Rio Conventions on climate, biodiversity, and desertification. UNEP alone houses over a dozen multilateral environmental agreements. And now on top of this, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, which lays out our collective blueprint for a sustainable world that underline that a healthy natural world is fundamental to a world free of poverty, hunger, war, and inequality. But look, I get it. It's easy to be down on multilateralism because multilateralism has not hit all its lofty targets. And even before COVID-19, progress across the SDGs was uneven. And we failed to meet the biodiversity targets made in 2010, called the Aichi targets, to halt biodiversity loss. And science reveals that the commitments we made under the Paris Agreement, on which are falling short, are not enough to make climate stability ensured. So yes, we must focus on where we've fallen short. But multilateralism is the only way to make a meaningful global push. And it has made a significant difference, even when we've not reached as far as we hoped. Maybe let us look for a moment at the Aichi targets, the biodiversity targets from 2010. Even though, yes, we did not meet these targets, as the recent Global Biodiversity Outlook tells us, nevertheless, we understand that we have more biodiversity-rich protected areas than we had in 2010. Not enough, but we made some progress. And countries are measuring themselves against these targets, and where fisheries are regulated, stocks grew. Not enough, but we're making progress. Where coordinated action was taken to slow deforestation, habitat loss was controlled. Not enough, but we made action forward. And where ecosystem restoration was implemented, the decades of degradation has been reversed. And I also mentioned the Vienna Convention to protect the ozone layer. Last week, we celebrated 35 years of the Montreal Protocol and the Vienna Convention. The convention united the world to protect the ozone layer, which is now healing. We are closing the ozone hole, saving millions of lives and avoiding damages to agriculture, fisheries, and materials, and our own health. Where multilateral action has been taking, things changed for the better. And so we can ask how the planet's biodiversity and ozone layer would have fared without multilateral action to drive the world forward. So I say to you that multilateralism as a system does work. It's only when we do not commit strongly enough or where we fail to live up to our commitments that we falter. I'm not alone in this belief. Yesterday, member states adopted a declaration committing to a stronger multilateralism. Across the 75th anniversary year, massive UN engagement exercise found that most people want more international cooperation, not less, more solidarity, not less, to deliver a greener and more just future. So multilateral cooperation across borders and political differences is the only way that we can take global actions to meet the demand of the youth and of the next generation. So a moment then on COVID-19 recovery and that green transition, because of course, we must now also contend with the brutal impact of COVID-19. The pandemic is rolling back decades of progress on poverty, on gender, on health. Progress that would not have happened without multilateral action. However, the pandemic gives us now an opportunity and an opening to recover better. This means placing this triple planetary crisis, the climate crisis, the nature crisis, and the pollution and waste crisis at the heart of economic decision-making and turning around from our unsustainable consumption and production patterns. Investing in green recovery makes economic sense. Spending on renewable energy can generate 2.5 times more jobs than spending on fossil fuels. Cleaner energy can reduce the burden of disease from air pollution, which costs some countries 7% of their GDP. And as we embark on the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, investing $1 in restoring ecosystems can generate $9 by way of return on ecosystem services and livelihoods. So we need to use all the tools we have in the toolbox, because never before has the world seen so much money injected into the economy. Governments can choose how to spend those monies in their stimulus packages. And let us remember that this money is our tax money, taxpayer generated, and therefore it needs to benefit the citizens and the future of societies. Bail out the old dirty economy or use every tool in the toolbox to forge that new green and sustainable future? The choice is pretty obvious. And so to speed up the green transition, stimulus packages should include bailouts with, yes, green strings attached, investments in nature-based solutions, sustainable agriculture, renewables, conservation and green infrastructure, loans and grants for green investments, green R&D subsidies, reinforcement of environmental legislation, ending fossil fuel subsidy, and levying carbon taxes. Now, some has been done, but more is ahead, because rightly, I think, the initial wave of the stimulus was fiscal in nature and cut checks or reduced taxes or reduced VAT to protect people, to protect jobs, and to protect companies. And that was the right thing to do. But as the second wave is rolling out, we need to make sure that some of the encouraging signs that we have seen are sustained and multiplied across the world. The European Union's 750 billion stimulus plan and the Green Deal, of course, show many green measures in agriculture, energy, and way beyond. But beyond Europe, South Korea's nearly 100 billion Green New Deal aims to create 1.9 million new jobs by 2025 through green transition in energy and housing and mobility and industry. Pakistan hired unemployed workers to plant saplings and seedlings under the 10 billion tree tsunami program. Colombia has announced huge investments in renewables, in tree planting and agroforestry. Costa Rica likewise. Barbados' stimulus package looks to build sustainable tourism sector and sustainable housing for the Barbadian people. And Senegal has exempted 22 different products used in renewable energy from VAT to boost green energy. Now, I'm not naive. Many countries are bailing out the old and the dirty and the grey and the unsustainable, but others are leading the way, and these countries will be the market leaders for decades to come. So while grounded in national realities, stimulus investments need to be anchored in these collective agreements that have a common roadmap for a more sustainable future, and that means the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement, the post-2020 biodiversity framework, and the post-2020 chemicals framework. For multilateralism to work, however, it needs everyone to pull together. It needs trust and transparency, ownership and optimism. It needs goals that can be broken down and implemented at the national levels, and then added up and measured at the international level to see that it's backing up the international goals. And it needs an informed public that hold governments and companies to account. These are important lessons, and we at UNEP have very much taken them to heart. Our new medium-term strategy, which is laser-focused on dealing with this triple crisis, is built on inclusive multilateralism that reaches beyond governments and supports systemic shifts with the collaboration of the private sector, of youth, of civil society, faith-based organizations, indigenous peoples, and so on. So in conclusion, let me say that obviously failure is not an option. Stimulus need to be green and to invest in that green transition. Stimulus packages need to be inclusive, pro-poor, and gender responsive. Unless these funds also tackle these triple planetary crises, we will be sawing off the branch that we sit on. In the post-pandemic world, only a reinvigorated multilateralism can deliver the best return for these investments and deliver a world in which we live in harmony with nature, with a stable climate, and in a pollution-free planet. So in the words of the late Wangari Maathai, who knew better than most how we depend on each other, she said, "We all share one planet and we are one humanity. There's no escaping that reality." I thank you.
We're really at the end of this story, as we know. We're in the midst of devastating climate change. The biodiversity is collapsing around us. I don't think it's I wouldn't say that we've made advances, but not enough. I would say we've been in reverse and going down, actually, like the WWF summary index showed last week. We have a real collapse of ecosystems. We've had one treaty that seems to me to have really worked well, and that's the Montreal Protocol. I wonder if what lessons you would derive from that. I have a couple favorites myself, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about why that one worked and how to make the same things work in other contexts, especially on decarbonization and on biodiversity conservation.
Well, just to go back to the biodiversity story, of course, we haven't reached where we want to reach. But what I was intending to communicate is that where countries take action, nature is very forgiving. It will bounce back. When
I agree with that. Yeah.
So it's not hopeless. You can take these actions, but we're not where we need to be.
Yeah.
So, you know, why has the Ozone Treaty been a success? In a sense, it has a narrower focus, if you like, and it would impact very directly our health. It had that immediacy that COVID-19 has, in a way. You would get entire populations in certain locations suffering from cancer, and there was. I don't want to oversimplify, a relatively simple techno fix, which meant different gases and different forms and different insulation materials, etc., etc. Now, I don't want to simplify because it's a hard battle and 35 years and we're still working on it. What I think we have understood here is nevertheless that cohesion that the ozone, that Montreal Protocol and the Vienna Convention lays with its deep science that has never been politicized, with its deep understanding that that science informs political action, and with the understanding that failure to act will not only lead to runaway climate change, but will also lead to runaway health catastrophe, focused the mind, and then that there was this alternative materials to be developed or that existed in their infancy. Climate change is much more complex, and biodiversity is even more complex, you could argue. But we've learned a lot, and I think we've also understood that renewables are on the market and very, very competitive, in fact, more competitive than dirty and gray. And so there is an understanding now that we can head in that direction. Biodiversity has had the difficulty with the IG targets being quite diffuse, and it has been difficult to translate that into precise action. And maybe also, you know, much biodiversity is lost by farming, and farming is something that we need, and it has been difficult to get farmers to work with biodiversity positive agriculture, which is something nevertheless that is moving in the right direction at this point.
Yeah, I think those are all excellent points, and I'd like to just make a comparison with the climate for a moment. With the ozone, we had chlorofluorocarbons, a range of gases, but all basically one class of gas that was destroying ozone. And there was a technofix, which was a different class of gases that wouldn't be ozone depleting. And then targets were set. And what strikes me as notable about the Montreal Protocol, different from the Paris Climate Agreement, for example, was that in the Montreal Protocol, it said that not only the users of these CFCs should phase out in 15 years originally, but also the producers should phase out. And that was very clear. Then this was applied to the local level in a very simple way. Everybody needed to phase out. There were nationally determined contributions of how much are you going to phase out of CFCs. It was everybody was on a timeline that was quite clear. And it seems to me that if we translate that to climate, which of course is more complex, but has some elements of this, we're not phasing out of energy, we're phasing out of fossil fuels. So we also are making a transition like the one from CFCs to HFCs. We're making a transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. Our targets are funny because we give no responsibility to the producing states at all in our targets. It's only the emissions of use. And so to my mind, the villains in the world are like the United States, which are drug pushers, but they're pushing fossil fuels. And the US, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Australia, Canada, they're the ones producing, but how come we don't have targets for production to phase out production? Stop producing this stuff. It's so dangerous for the world. And you have, 20 years to phase out, and the others have 20 years to phase in their solar panels and their wind turbines, or else they're not going to have energy. And then we'd all be on a pathway for success.
Well, of course, if you could have waved that magic wand back in Rio 1992 and just made that happen, of course, that would have been a different reality than what we're journeying now. I think what we have is, however, that these are negotiations, and I can be as frustrated as you, but the bottom line was that under the Ozone Treaty, of course, resources were also made available to enable the phase out for industries, and UNEP, we're a proud host of the Multilateral Fund that is funneling this money into the phase out and into the retrofitting. For those countries that are developing and are, and you didn't mention, say, South Africa or other countries that, Mongolia, others that have, huge, let's say, coal deposits and have built an economy around that. The shift is hard, and this is where international solidarity has to come into the picture. Funding adequately the Green Climate Fund, ensuring that there is some understanding of loss and damage, ensuring that, and these have been hard and tricky issues to negotiate, right? So you're of course right that the big producers have not been putting up their hand in 1992 and said, okay, we will commit to a phase out. But it has been a journey. And meanwhile, and here's the good news, is that renewable energy has really taken root, not as fast as we would like to see, not as deep as we would like to see, but countries that have promoted renewable energy don't need to really subsidize it at all anymore.
Right.
Because it's completely available and completely competitive. And that's super positive. And you see countries like Morocco that were net importers of all energy. And you've seen they were early movers in solar, and you've seen what that done to them. They with the Ouarzazate plant that has, they invested 1 billion 10 years ago in solar. You've seen what Kenya has done, putting in money into geothermal and wind. So there are some amazing early movers that have essentially begun to free them from imports and begun to free them from being a polluting economy. So yes, you're right. That magic wand was not waivable, but I do think that those who have moved first and we're moving now will be market competitive and will leapfrog over that polluting age, which is what we want.
I think just one more point or detail on this. To my mind, the big problem in the world is not countries that don't have fossil fuels, because, like you say, they've already realized sunshine and wind is better than importing coal and oil. The big problem is in places that have lots of fossil fuels. These are really the countries that are resistant and are wrecking the world. Actually, the world for all those that don't have the fossil fuels as well. and when the problem there is that the story that we tell of green recovery, creating new jobs and so forth, which is absolutely true, doesn't ring true.
Even countries that are highly dependent on hydrocarbon, such as, say, South Africa, are making moves and investments into renewable. Now, this is hard, and we need to understand that this is hard, right? Canada, that is also highly dependent, are struggling with this, but it is not easy, because you don't want, and this is why it's easy to say leave no one behind, but how to? And so that is where these stimulus packages need to come in and ensure that there is a safety net, that people are not left behind. And that means an all of government and an all of society approach, because you can't leave that mining town just dead. And so ensuring that there is a degree of planning and a degree of investment going. So I get it, but I also get it plays into politics, and it does that all over the world. I do think, though, and I think, Jeffrey, from the work that we do, it's sort of the young people that we have to place our trust in. And I see young people across the world mobilizing for that greener, cleaner world, and that gives me hope.
Great. I wonder if you could, on the one more on this theme of how do we make biodiversity targets local and specific? Because when they're global, they're not translatable. And this morning at the UN, I'll make another political statement because I'm a professor, so I can make such obnoxious statements. But President Bolsonaro, who is presiding over rampant Amazon destruction, said to the world, we protect the Amazon, we're the most environmentally friendly country, and so forth. A bunch of nonsense. Because we see the satellite readings every month, and the forest is being consumed by destruction, forest fires, and the like. How do we create accountability at the local level of biodiversity? Because we're going to lose it. It's just going to be destroyed in the next 10 years in the rainforest areas everywhere, because the margin of destruction is so rampant right now. And at least the good news is we can watch it from the satellite day by day. So what can we do to really make accountability so that politicians can't get away with this kind of statement?
Well, in general, look, we're losing biodiversity in the oceans, we're losing biodiversity on terrestrial land, and not just in the tropical forest. So that's probably an important takeaway.
Yep.
In Europe, where you have, essentially every square inch developed, I'm exaggerating to make the point. But there you have seen over the decades and over the centuries, massive biodiversity loss. So own that. So then think about what kind of nature positive agriculture can, for example, the EU encourage, which is why we're encouraged by the Green Deal. Fragmentation and infrastructure is the biggest, and obviously deforestation and invasive species are some of the greatest driver of loss. So to get to what some people and my old colleagues in IUCN referred to in sort of tongue-in-cheek adaptability, how do you add up that what every country does? I think in 2010, we agreed on these national biodiversity strategies and action plans, but they were not necessarily aligned with the Aichi targets. So you couldn't actually very well add them up. Moreover, they were agreed by very, very good and drafted by very, very good ministers of environment, but they were not mainstreamed into where biodiversity loss is occurring, which is often if there is a Ministry of Forestry, a Ministry of Agriculture, a Ministry of Industry, a Ministry of Infrastructure. And so understanding, and this is what my colleague Elizabeth Marema, who's the Executive Secretary for the Biodiversity Convention, is pushing, that this will have to be a much broader thing than a little environmental bubble that will agree on the next set of targets. We learned in Paris that it is when industry, and at that time when mayors, when those that own the climate shift or the climate solutions, We learned that it's when business, when those kind of companies and individuals lean in, that you can strike agreements. And frankly, the chorus, as you well know, was at times louder outside the negotiations than inside. And that was it gave courage to the negotiators. We hope that we can get to something similar. Now, on the climate, we were greatly aided by having a unified target, an apex target, less than 2 degrees.
Exactly.
You could argue that we didn't have an ocean warming target. We didn't have an acidification target. We didn't have so many other things that in an ideal world, maybe we would have liked. But we had this one sort of Southern Cross, North Star, whatever you want to call it, that we were heading for and sailing on. And that was important. So that then meant that countries, companies, etc., could begin to model themselves on this. Biodiversity, we are still negotiating, but there is a degree and a sort of a living in harmony with nature, no net loss, and looking at biodiversity as an element that is made up of species loss, ecosystem loss, and genetic diversity loss, or the other, put it in the positive. These 3 dimensions we need to be observing. And finally, we need to be clear that where we're losing biodiversity is obviously not in the protected areas. We're losing it in where you and I live. And so we need to understand that we need to integrate biodiversity into the built environment, into the agricultural fields. And then, yes, what kind of monitoring and reporting mechanism will be in place? And this is in negotiations right now. You know, in climate, we had a lot of discussions around MRV. That's clearly not the conversations in climate and biodiversity, but what kind of reporting will it be and how robust will it be? And here, citizen science, the eye in the sky, media and scientists can actually do a lot more than you can necessarily on climate. It's harder, right? So encouraging that will also presumably be part and parcel of a solution package, not necessarily in the negotiation framework, but simply people calling for it. So we still have some way to go. The COP is in May of next year, and there's a lot of work underway. But I remain cautiously hopeful that we will get to something that will have a greater stretch of a vision and a greater degree of accountability for
I think when we look at the climate progress, or however one wants to characterize it, the greatest handhold that we have right now is the 1.5 degrees C target. And it was actually quite ingenious and lucky that in the Paris Agreement, it said keep warming below 2 degrees and aim to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. And then the IPCC report was really a wonderful contribution to say it makes a big difference whether it's 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. And now we have pretty much a global standard, other than I would say the White House, but generally we have a global standard that says 1.5 degrees C, and we have a scientific assessment that means decarbonize by mid-century, or climate neutrality by mid-century. This morning, President Xi announced that China is committed to climate neutrality by 2060. That was actually a big advance because there was no target out there beforehand. Now we have to move it earlier because 2060 is not good enough, but still it's a big advance. But on biodiversity, we still don't have something like that. We don't have a clear benchmark, and if it's too complicated, it also will remain a global generality that will not really guide either the businesses, as you rightly mentioned, or the governments, or the accountability towards the global target. And what makes the 1.5 degrees work, it seems to me, is that it says everybody must decarbonize by 2050. So you can judge a national action, no matter what governments are announcing. It's pretty easy to look, that's not enough, that is enough. Europe's Green Deal is good, this one isn't good. But how are we going to do that on biodiversity in some crisp way to say, you're not doing it? And that's what I think is really, really missing right now.
I mean, I've gone on record, so, you know, I've said it before, but even before coming to this job, that wouldn't it be great if we had an apex target and a scale? I've been cheeky enough to say that when Alexander Celsius designed the scale, you know, he wasn't thinking about Paris. So scientists outside of a negotiation room can actually design a scale. And I've challenged the science world to do just that. And I think that if the science world did that, it may not walk into the negotiations because that's too close and too untested. But I think it would grow legs and people will familiarize themselves with it. And I know that there are scientists sitting here and they're working exactly on this. And that scale would be, to my mind, a combo of genetic, species, and ecosystems. And, you know, somebody smart could plot a gap and see where we are. It doesn't need to be within a negotiation. What needs to be in the negotiations and what would appear to be coming, but we're still in the negotiations, is certainly known, the idea that by 2050 and by 2030, certain targets have been met. And that this idea of translating living with harmony, in harmony with nature means no further species loss other than natural losses, which occur naturally, and defining that. And then working on this scale. Now, it's true, this is a catch-up because the Celsius scale had been in existence for quite some time and people knew heat and so on. But I think that, look, it's much harder because an orchid in one place, a butterfly in another, and a savanna that becomes desertified and a wetland that is disappearing. How do you square it all together? That's the crux of the matter, which is why the national plans need to be totally aligned with what the targets are so that we can add them up with greater degree of accountability. And then we need to have something that captures the public's imagination. Some people are calling for sort of 30 by 30, 50 by 50, that kind of thing. And that's fine, you know, as a call, but here it is. We're not losing biodiversity in the protected areas. We're losing biodiversity in the unprotected areas. So we need to actually rethink agriculture, rethink pesticides, rethink insecticides, rethink fragmentation, rethink trade, because that's how we have endangered species, right? I mean, phytosanitary dimensions of trade. And those elements will certainly be very key to ensure that we can bring down losses. So it's complex, but well, if those scientists continue their good work and publish widely and so on, that will be super helpful because someone will come up with a report that will put, you might do that, and put country on a scale and call them out. And I think that is part of holding to account in a global setting.
Thanks a lot. Very helpful, really helpful. Can you explain to us, maybe in closing, a little bit about what the timeline is now for the different treaties, how things ideally should progress, what we should be working towards in terms of 2021, what could be done in the interim? And by the way, I actually like the fact that the General Assembly was online today so that everybody could watch. Could we make these big conferences live and online also, so that there could be participation from outside and maybe less travel, but even more participation?
All right, so I'll start with the first part, and I'm aware that we're running against the clock, but let me just say that I think, well, obviously the biodiversity conversation, negotiations is absolutely critical. There are a number of SAPSTA meetings, etc. They keep having to readjust because of the current situation, but the COP is so far still anchored in May. we'll see if that will hold, but you know, we're living in this weird world. As for climate, our primary press and push right now is to get ambitious NDCs in, and to have those big emitters, essentially the G20 minus plus,
Yep.
To really make some ambitious commitment. And you've heard the Secretary General going on record saying, look, we should not be doing any more new coal plants, right? I mean,
right.
We should not be doing this. So I think the UN has gone on record. It doesn't square off with it doesn't square and meet with our Paris commitment. So ambitious NDCs, and there are over 100 countries that have committed to ambition, but it's 17% of the global emissions or something like that. So we need to have more ambition here. Now, your second part of the question was what?
It was about online.
Online.
Yeah.
So you will not be surprised that this executive director from UNEP obviously thinks that the more we can ensure inclusion and have NGOs having presence and so on, but also minimize our carbon footprint, the better it is. I think we do need to meet in person from time to time, because it's very hard to do tough negotiations. But we in UNEP, way back in March, commissioned a little work, internal work, where we said, what does environmental governance look like in a pandemic setting? And there are some shifts that need to be made. So I think that we are learning so much, not just from international, not just in international diplomacy, but across the world, about how we can make use and greater transparency and holding to account of international diplomacy. Mind you, and being based in Kenya and working with many countries in the global south, we need to then find solutions to the connectivity haves and the connectivity have-nots, which means ensuring that investments from private and public sectors into fiber optic and into underwater cables, etc., can ensure connectivity. And that is not the case today. So in-person will continue for some time, but we need to continue pushing in that direction.